today. We're going to talk about teens in crisis, and hopefully identifying them before crisis hits, recognizing some red flags. I'm sure all of you guys have worked with teenagers that have been in some form of crisis, and so we're going to talk about some red flags to look for beforehand, some ways that we can respond as youth workers. When I say youth ministers, I mean all people that minister to youth, paid, unpaid, volunteer, etc., pastors, everyone. So let's talk about some definitions real quick. At-risk youth. And if you want me to email you this PowerPoint afterwards, you can just write down your email and I'll email it to you, so you don't have to write down everything on it if you want. So an at-risk youth is someone who is less likely to transition successfully into adulthood. And then the big question is, what does successfully look like? And that does look different for every person and every family and every situation, but the general definition is that they are able to avoid crime, achieve some academic success, and become financially independent. Those are kind of the three markers that most people look for when it comes to success. I have other markers too. I'll just say that some of my markers are being able to have healthy relationships. I think is really important. A lot of times we only look at the measurable successes, and we forget to really think about the emotional, spiritual components of success. And so healthy relationships, obviously in our setting, ideally having some sort of faith formation would be another definition of success. So what teens are at risk for crisis? These are all based off of studies that have been done in the U.S. They're probably the highest populations of teens that are in crisis. Most of you probably have at least one category of these in your youth ministries. Teens in the foster system, I know here in Central Florida we have a lot of teens in the foster system in our youth ministries because we have the 40 United Methodist Children's Home right outside of Orlando, and so a lot of teens are in this area that are in the foster care system or are placed in homes locally, so that's something I know I see often. They're obviously a little bit more at risk because one of our core basic hierarchies of needs is security. Security and stability, and they've to a certain extent lost that. Some kids moving into foster care gain a sense of security and stability, but still being outside of your family system doesn't foster that feeling. Minority teens, especially with all of the racially charged things that have been going on the past few years, and especially with the most recent election, minority teens are really, we're starting to see a little bit of a spike in suicide rates with minority adolescents, as well as symptoms of depression and anxiety right now. So I'll be interested to see if that subsides or continues to grow. Same actually trend with LGBTQ teens, and there's a bunch of other letters that go past Q now. I didn't put them on there because I had never but they're most all still included in that LGBTQ an acronym. So again, here in Orlando with the Pulse incident, we've also seen a pretty big spike locally in these teens feeling unsafe and unaccepted. Children of substance abusers, that's not a new issue by any means. That's a huge at risk. Typically they're at risk for abuse, and they're also at risk at higher risk for using and abusing substances at an earlier age than their parents, which is an interesting trend. I do notice in my experience, which doesn't always show in research, kids tend to swing one way or the other. Completely anti everything, never will touch it in my life, or this is an acceptable way to cope. Typically it is an acceptable way to cope to them just because that's the environment and that's the coping mechanisms that they've grown up learning. It's a learned behavior. Children exposed to domestic violence. I know here in Florida, and I don't know the laws in Tennessee or Texas, but here in Florida, we are required to report if there's domestic violence in the home, even if the child isn't specifically being abused. So that is still something that's traumatic for obvious reasons. And then childhood trauma, physical, sexual, psychological, emotional abuse, any sort of childhood trauma, PTSD symptoms. If a child or adolescent loses their parent, that can be a huge trauma, or a sibling. I've worked with a couple students that have lost a sibling in a tragic car accident. One was in a four-wheeling accident. And so anytime that there's childhood trauma, it puts a teen at a higher risk because they're dealing with a whole set of emotions and questions that aren't necessarily normal to wrap your brain around at that age. Recent research is interesting, actually. I think it was a 2014 survey or research article that said affluent youth. They're actually starting to target that population and doing some more in-depth and long-term studies. That's kind of been a population that we've kind of said, oh, you're good, you're stable, you've got resources. I see you guys shaking your head because you probably all have had experiences with some affluent youth that have been very at risk due to absentee parenting, workaholic parents, increased access to substances and to higher cost substances that can have more effects and more overdose potential. Excuse me. And so it's interesting that finally the secular studies are catching up with what we already know in the church, is that these are typically families that are able to have lawyers so that they can hide their issues. They're not public. The kids are told not to talk about them, and so they end up just internalizing a lot of the things that go on in their life and not ever really learning how to deal with it or work through some of those issues. And so then also insert materialism and as a way of escape. I'll just go play with my toys and not have to deal with real life. So I'm interested to see as more research comes out about that. There's not a whole lot out there on that, but there have been a few statistically significant research articles in the past couple of years. So really, all teens are at risk for crisis. And that's really hard for us because it's hard to figure out how to identify before the crisis hits so that we can have some prevention and some intervention help. All teens are at risk for a couple reasons. One, their developmental stage. They are in the process of creating some autonomy from their families, from their family systems, from their family traditions, which is what sometimes includes us if they've grown up in the church. Adolescence is a time where they kind of maybe give a little bit of pushback. I don't know if this is my faith. I don't know if I want this as a part of my life or a key part of my life at this time. And part of it's just their developmental stage of trying to create some autonomy from their parents or the guardians or whoever is the respected person in their life. The second reason teens are at risk is they are trying to develop their abstract thinking skills. Right around that puberty mark is when abstract thinking starts to come into play more fully. And they start to look at the world as more gray instead of black and white. And so, I know the drinking age is 21, but I'm a pretty mature freshman in high school. I should be able to handle this, So instead of the law is law, their brain just stops thinking in that black and white and it's starting to think abstractly, like, maybe it's kind of flexible. Like, my parents give me champagne on New Year's Eve, so why couldn't I, So they start to integrate a lot of their experiences and think more abstractly about their decisions. The third reason is that they This is a time of impulsivity, mostly due to hormones. As they're going through those hormone growth things, impulsivity really spikes. That's why actually in adolescence, when we're making an ADHD diagnosis, because impulsivity is one of the main characteristics of that, we actually need to ask for a lot of history to make sure that impulsivity was an issue as a child, and in multiple settings, home, school, other settings like church, with more people than just parents, because it could just be hormonal, and so there's so many things going on at this stage of life. The really interesting thing is one of my favorite research articles to give is a National Geographic's article that I can email you guys too. I didn't bring it with me, that pulls in some research that neurologists have done. And I love to give it to parents when they say, like, my kid's going crazy, just overnight they like shifted and their brain's out of whack. And neurologists actually have started comparing the different growth spurts that our brains have throughout our lifetime. Well, really, like 25 is kind of the last one that a brain goes through a growth spurt, but it's just all downhill from there, which is unfortunate. But yeah, so I know it's really disappointing. Right when a teenager hits puberty, neurologists are recognizing that their brain has the same amount of rapid development. And it's not so much growth in size, it's at the teenage years, it's growth in synapses, as a 2-year-old's rapid growth has in size. And so if you think about that, teenagers are going through their terrible twos again, but it's not socially acceptable for them to lay on the floor and scream and kick. And so they have to figure out what to do with those thoughts and feelings and emotions and that growth that's going on in that physical way as well as in their abstract thinking development. And so often that's they just act out in different ways. Parents usually talking back is what I hear the most. They're so disrespectful. Well, yeah, they're impulsive and their brain's growing. If your 2-year-old, was your 2-year-old disrespectful? Yep. So it's kind of that same thinking. Christian youth are not necessarily exempt, as I'm sure you all know. Here's a little video with some statistics in it.
All right, did everyone have a good week? you have a good week?
Yeah, it was fine.
That is on YouTube, and it is called 2 Hours of Statistics. I think. So it's basically, these are things that they track in about 2 hours. So what do we do, or how do we recognize these at-risk teenagers, which is kind of all of them, but how do we pinpoint some of those signs, some of those red flags before they actually hit those crises that we just saw? Here are some generals. There's obviously way more than this. Excuse me. But some things that students will do is they'll especially if they're having a really hard time, they'll make some passive suicidal statements. This is a hard thing to determine in our culture today, because how many times at youth group do you hear, "Shoot me now," or, "Oh, that's so annoying," and people do the hand motion, which I hate the hand motion. So these passive suicidal statements are sometimes a little hard to recognize. They typically tend to be a little more descriptive, like, "The world would be better off without me," "I just can't do this anymore." And usually those are not active suicidal statements where a student's actually considering suicide, a suicide attempt. These passive suicidal statements are typically an "I'm feeling overwhelmed" statement, and I don't know what to do. So my only thought is to escape, which is most people's typical response. I'm sure you guys have all felt that way in this room at different points in your life. I know I've felt that way at different points in my life. Like, this is so much to handle what's going on in life right now. I'm not sure how I'm going to work through this. And so that can be a red flag. It can be a really tiny red flag. It's something that often gets overlooked. The active suicidal statements are the ones that get your attention real quick. Where they're saying, "I want to take my life, I don't want to live anymore." Those are much more active suicidal statements. Obviously, if a child is telling you that they have a plan for completing suicide, that is, at that point in time, I consider that crisis mode, and they need to be admitted into inpatient treatment. And so that's kind of the passive suicidal statements. Then there's what's called suicidal ideation, which is active suicidal thoughts, which eventually turn into statements of suicidality, which then turn into a specific plan. And once you get to plan, that's crisis, because developmentally teenagers are impulsive. So 1 minute they may have a plan. 5 minutes from now they may regret making that plan, or 5 minutes from now they may have completed that plan. Unfortunately, they're that impulsive. So that's why the passive suicidal statements are really important. And not to say that every child that says "Oh, it's the end of the world, my parents are getting divorced, I can't go on like this, I'm not gonna, I refuse to live in a family that's divorced," or something like that. Yes, that's a little bit of a passive suicidal statement, but really what that means is, I need more conversation about this. I need an outlet. I need a place to talk about how the situation feels unmanageable to me, is usually what that student is communicating. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, sorry. So that's kind of one red flag. A second red flag is isolating themselves from family and friends. Again, a hard one to recognize sometimes, because how many parents do you have say, their face is in their phone and they sit in their room and play on the computer all day? That's isolation from family. The key is both scenarios, family and friends. Say you have a student that comes to youth group, they're usually fairly social. Maybe they have a couple really close friends and they kind of stop coming to youth group. You ask their close friend, like, hey, where's Janie been? I don't know, I haven't seen her in a couple weeks. Oh, really? Huh? Is she out of town? No. Interesting. Those are the times that, like, hey, let me shoot Janie a text. Let me call and see, like, hey, we were just thinking about you. We missed you at youth group. Just to kind of see. Sometimes it's something bizarre, like they've been really busy, and and that's why it's helpful to have that relationship with your students, so like, oh, well, softball started back up, so she's probably been at practice, and been busy, really busy. But if you start to see some behavior of isolation, especially if they're in a group, and they usually participate, and then all of a sudden they're sitting out. I don't want to play the games. I don't want to participate. I'm not talking to anybody. That's definitive isolation behavior. And so those are some key things to look for there. The next one is they display some sort of sudden change. And it could be a sudden change in anything, mood, behavior, appearance. Their attendance could drop off all of a sudden and you never see them. Maybe they are in student leadership and they stop showing up to things, or they're usually always responsible and they stop showing up with their lesson or whatever they're supposed to be prepared for. Any sort of sudden change. And there are things that we may notice that even their parents may not, because of that relationship that we, our volunteers, have with our students. There might be some things that their parents aren't noticing at home, but you will notice in your setting. Typically, teens that are feeling overwhelmed ask for help. Usually it's from a peer or a friend, which is why one of the big things that I try to do in my youth group is to talk about how to be a good friend. A good friend is keeping confidentiality and knowing when to break confidentiality. When you're seriously concerned about your friend, that's the time where you go tell an adult. I tell my students all the time, you can tell me anything. If I'm really concerned, we're going to have a conversation with someone else about it. If you're, doing a very high-risk behavior, we're going to have a conversation with somebody else about it. But I want you to be able to feel like you can be open and honest with me. I tell other people, like the other students in my ministry when I do teachings on this, is that, your friend may be mad at you for telling their parent that they've been cutting, or that they are making a plan to complete suicide, but your friend's going to be alive to be mad at you. And so that seems to be a pretty powerful statement for teenagers, that it clicks. Like, oh, yeah. And they realize, I don't want to live with the guilt of knowing something and not acting on it. So that's some of that preventative stuff that we can do before the crisis actually hits, where there is a suicide attempt, or, if there's domestic violence in the home, before a child actually is hurt. Because students usually reach out for help before the crisis hits. It's just that help doesn't always get to the next level of being able to have action or intervention. Another kind of red flag is engaging in high-risk behaviors, and we'll talk next about what are some of those high-risk behaviors. But a lot of the time, students will share with you the stuff that's going on, or your volunteers. They may not share with their parents. A lot of times students see you all as safe people full of grace and love and mercy and acceptance. Also, our kind of unique benefit of being youth directors, we have no punishing rights on the kids. I can't ground them, you know, but we can sit there and have a very open and honest communication about that behavior and about, you know, responsibility, and are you mature enough to be doing this if you can't have a conversation with your parents about it and stuff like that. So a lot of times kids are going to open up to us and our volunteers and their mentors before they even are necessarily going to open up to their parents. So what are some of these high-risk behaviors? Probably the pretty typical ones that you guys would guess. Truancy at school, skipping school. The hard part for me is we live like 3 blocks from the beach, so our kids go to school all the time to go surfing. They literally have like an app that dings when it's like good surf conditions and they're off to the beach. So that's challenging. Substance use and abuse. There is a big, most students experiment with substance use or abuse in their high school years. Now it's actually, I see a lot of middle schoolers for alcohol and marijuana usage. But usually they will experiment at least once before leaving high school. When it becomes a pattern of use, or there's intoxication every single use, that would be considered abuse. And so that's an important distinction that sometimes parents fail to make. You know, my kid tried, you know, a beer at a party and didn't like it, and they're freaking out because they think their child's an alcoholic. You know, and I do realize there's that fine line of, is this child telling the truth? But, you know, there is that I wanted to try it, it's not for me, and see if that, you know, rings true with the next few months of their life versus a consistent pattern.
And I know from personal experience that substance abuse can really go beyond what we usually think of it being drugs, alcohol, and all of the video games. And,
Video games, pornography.
But like if you go to get professional help for a video game addiction, it's still not known out there that can be an addiction, but it clearly is. It's clearly being used in the same way that
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I have a lot of students that have technology issues with addiction, and a lot of it eventually leads to pornography in college years because that becomes a source of stimulation for the brain, and so it forms the same types of neuropathways that substances form in our actual brain chemistry. And so it's just like getting that next fix of adrenaline. And same thing, you know, risk-taking behaviors like jumping off roofs and stuff like that. Like, it's an adrenaline kick is what it is. And now I have to do the next best thing to get my adrenaline to trigger again, even though that's a very dangerous thing to get wrapped up in. So there are so many different triggers. Thank you for bringing that up. And speaking of also sex addiction, unprotected sex or sex with multiple or unknown partners or all of the above. So that's another high-risk behavior. A hard one, because as the church, and I know as youth directors, it's challenging sometimes because we don't always know what are my boundaries on what I can talk about with sex and sexual activity with my students, because I'm sure it changes depending on what pastors you're working under. It changes depending on what church, what community environment you're working in, small town versus big city, etc. And then also from family unit to family unit, you know, they're going to have varying views on that. I tell my parents, I talk to all my youth about sex. We do a retreat for parents and students on sex. I know our Florida United Methodist Warren Willis summer camp does Created by God for 5th graders. And then we've just been working on, I'm not sure if they're going to continue it yet with the change in directors, but a retreat called Sex, Drugs, Rock and Roll, where we talk about a lot of these high-risk behaviors with freshmen in high school when they go through that transition. And then we also have a retreat for juniors and seniors in high school transitioning into college called College Connection. So there are resources out there, at least here in Florida, to talk about that. But it is challenging. But I tell kids and their parents, it's better to talk about it. I know it's uncomfortable, but you've got to talk about it. If you're talking to your child about sex in 9th grade, it's too late. And parents, like, their eyes get this big, and they're like, what? So I know I'm preaching to the choir here on that. Another high-risk behavior, restricting eating, binging, and purging. Sometimes we'll notice that because of youth meals. One of my middle school girls telling me the other day about the calorie content in pretzels and just bizarre things where I'm like, I never even thought about that, but okay, let's talk more about that. But that would be that little red flag. Like, why is an 80-pound 6th grader counting her pretzel calories? Okay, let's talk about your self-image. Why does that concern you? And so when we get to this type of behavior, the actual restricting their eating, or binging and purging, or over exercise, those are a little bit more high risk and have some long-term effects. Self-harm, cutting, burning, it takes all sorts of different forms now, which sometimes is hard to recognize. That's not always something that we will see, because students are getting better and better at hiding it and performing self-harm only in very private places where most adults don't see, under their undergarment lines and things like that. So that's actually something that's being even more challenging for parents to even pick up on as students are communicating with each other and sharing ways to continue self-harm behavior and get away with it undetected. Fighting at school and outside of school. There was this whole trend, it was like a couple of years ago, where kids would what they call it, phasing or something like that. Is that what it was called? I forget now. Where they would literally go to somebody's house and they'd just fight each other. Like friends. Yeah, bizarre. Just really fighting, they would really hurt each other. Girls, guys, everybody. So it was very interesting. So there's some interesting trends that come and go. But obviously anger outbursts, fighting, beating up people in school, getting beat up, getting bullied. These are all kind of red flags and high-risk behaviors. Obviously running away. And running away could be, an hour to weeks, months. And so anytime a student leaves the home intentionally with the intentions that I'm upset about a situation and I'm escaping the situation and avoiding the situation and I don't want my parents to know where I am, that's a high-risk behavior, obviously for safety reasons. So let's have some discussion. If you guys will get with a partner and share about a time you worked with a teen in crisis and around these two questions.
She wants to go to FIU. And I am not getting into that.
Does anybody have anything that they want to share? Things that were eye-opening to you in retrospect, or?
Oh, I will. I was just saying, we have a girl in our youth group whose parents got divorced 11 years ago in Haiti, and her father is still in Haiti, and he remarried years ago. So for a long time, this girl has had no father figure in her life until last Saturday when her mom married me. So now I have a stepdaughter in the youth group. And my youth director didn't know we were going to get married. She wanted to keep it quiet. We didn't even do it in the church. We found a notary and got married in his office. I didn't want to do it that way, but I had to respect her wishes. And we carpooled together up here, my youth director and I told him yesterday morning about it, and I said, I now have a stepdaughter in the youth group. He said, that's awkward. But it's not like I wasn't there before.
Right.
And she's kind of quiet and detached somewhat. I think she has accepted me, but it's a little hard to tell. She has girlfriends in the youth group that she will talk to, and that's about it. She's a level-headed kid. She seems okay. I don't think she's in crisis. That's mainly the reason I wanted to come to this seminar. Because she is 17, she will be 18 February 15th. She graduates this June, so she won't be in the group much longer, and I'm actually sorry about that. It's my first marriage. I've never been married before, and I have no kids of my own that I'm aware of, so I've never been a father before, and that's a learning experience for me as well.
Yeah, really.
So I just wanted to bring that up to see what any of the rest of you think. Does it sound like there's a problem here?
I'll just offer that, knowing that I adopted a teenager, and I know of somebody else who has adopted someone who they pretty much raised, that all adopted kids, I think at some point, get confused. And when they get confused, they get angry. They'll let you know when they're in crisis. I think at some point you will have some reaction from her.
I hope it's positive.
I'm just offering that
Yeah.
there will be something that won't be positive, but you just don't know what it will be. So
Right.
just be aware of those signs.
I'm scared.
Don't be too scared. The step-parent role, I think, is one of the hardest roles in the family. And what I usually tell with the families that I work with is that the step-parent role is to build relationship. It should be the number one priority, especially early off.
Right. Before we were married, I said, does she know that we're getting married? Mother said, of course she does. And I said, Mother said, I told her. I said, well, what did she say? Nothing. I said, nothing? Oh, she's happy for us. And that was the extent of the conversation. And right after we were married, I said to her, Mom, I want to say something to her, but I want you to hear it. And she said, what do you want to say to her? And I had to preview it, but that's okay. I said, I just want to tell her I'm proud to be your stepfather, and I love you as if you were my own daughter, which is absolutely true. And she said, oh, thank you. I love you too. You know, she said it kind of matter-of-factly, but at least she said it.
Right. And she may not, like you said, not having a father figure in her life, the majority of her life, may not really know what that means. May not know what to expect, may not, so it's kind of exciting. You and her get to learn together
Right.
what a father-daughter relationship looks like.
Yeah.
So at least you don't have the pressure of her necessarily comparing. So that's good.
In a way, I'm glad that she has a daughter instead of a son. I think it would be harder with a son.
It can be. Well, thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Anybody else have anything they want to share from your discussion? You don't have to.
I had an awkward experience a few years ago. There was a kid in youth group, and he did have a lot of, kind of known that he had a lot of signs and a lot of crisis, and so we definitely, a lot of the youth leaders, we definitely kind of went our way to kind of take him under our wing and help him, and then one night he runs away from home, and he shows up at my home. And I remember I answered the door and he's like, hey, so just curious, what's protocol if one of your youth group students runs away,
I have a
but
friend.
then shows up, I need a place to stay. And I was like, well, can't stay here. You literally ran and it looks like I kidnapped you. So I called his mom and we went to Waffle House and we talked about I'm like, so what happened? He did have a cool thing about it, saying that years ago, so I could say now, knowing him now, he's evened out a lot. There's good things happened, it's worked out, but there was a lot of, there was tough times with him. We were worried. Just one of those kids, you're like, hey, do you want to go to this youth retreat this weekend? He's like, I gotta ask my parole officer. you know.
Mhm. Yeah, and I would say probably in my experience, 95% of the kids we work with are amazing post-college. And go on to do amazing things that I never would have tagged for them, but things that God had for them that were way greater than I could see, which is the exciting part of doing youth ministry long term. The key is them having someone to walk through the crisis with them so that they can get through that. Cool. All right, so our role, a couple response things. Our role as a youth minister is not savior. Let Jesus be Jesus, you be you. We are also not parent, unless you are a parent. and that will be a challenging role for those of us that have kids. When our child does get to be a teenager, if we're still doing youth ministry, that'll be new territory.
Yeah.
But typically we may agree, we disagree with parenting styles, parenting response. Ultimately, we're still not parent or guardian. We're there to support and to encourage and not to pass down disciplines or how things are handled. With that said, you do still have to set some boundaries. I took a kid on a mission trip to Costa Rica. He stole something while we were in country, almost got arrested in country, craziness ensued. It ended up being completely fine. Got home, had a conference with him and his legal guardian, which was his grandmother, and tons of issues, childhood. So I know why he's engaging in this behavior. However, the response was, don't do that again. And which was terribly disappointing for me because I'm like, oh wow, no wonder he has no boundaries. And so I had to make a professional boundary for myself and say, hey, unless you can show to me over the next year that I can really trust you, I'm not going to be able to take you out of the country again. Because it's a risk to my job, it's a risk to the rest of our group, there's liability issues there. So I had to set a professional boundary with that and had to define for him, this is what it would look like for me to trust you. You have to stop telling stories that are outrageous because we know that at least part of them is not true. And so, I had to really define for him, this is how you earn my trust back. So sometimes you have to set professional boundaries, but, obviously we can't hand out punishments per se. We're not professional counselors, and you don't want to act as one unless you have the liability insurance to cover you. So we do, I'll go over later, have some mandatory reporting, at least in the state of Florida, things
Love that shirt.
on us. Yeah, right? So our role as youth ministers is building relationships. We're not going to recognize red flags, signs, warning signs prior to crisis unless we have a relationship with kids. You were sharing about a student that came on Sunday morning for 1 hour that you had minimal interaction with, that you later found out was engaging in self-harm behavior. And you're like, there's no way I would have, had any clue. And that's true. There are certain students that you will not see warning signs with because you don't have that kind of relationship with them. You don't see them that often. That relationship just hasn't had time to develop or build. That's the really challenging part about getting 6th graders in, is because you have to start that relationship building process over every year with your 6th graders or however your ministry is structured. Training and equipping volunteers is another one of our roles. How do our volunteers build relationships? And 2, having volunteers. We shouldn't be the only adult contact that every student in our ministry has with the church. Because what happens when we leave, I see it all the time. The youth pastor leaves, everybody loves the youth pastor's connection to the youth pastor, there goes church connection. You get a whole different group of students when the new youth pastor comes in. And what happens with all these students that previously had a connection to the church, a connection to God, where do they hang? And so it's really important to have other safe adults in your ministry, confirmation sponsors, UMW prayer partners, something. Even if it's, assign UMW ladies to pray for a specific student and say send them a card on their birthday and, one other time of the year or something like that. Just so a student has another connection to the church and the ministry besides you. I do want to plug here, I'm not going to talk about it in depth, but the importance of having a solid youth and child protection policy at your church. That's vitally important. Your conference should have at least a template for that. And we should be following it. If you have a policy and you're not following it, you're liable. So try your best. And obviously, life happens, ministry happens. That the kid's parent doesn't show up for 30 minutes after, and you're sitting there alone with a child of the opposite gender. I understand life happens, but to the best of your ability in practical life, follow it. Our role is also utilizing the team's strengths and spiritual gifts, figuring out your kids' spiritual gifts, plugging them into student leadership, which is really hard when they may also be engaging in high-risk behaviors. How do I give a student leadership opportunity when I know they're partying every weekend? How do we hold that intention, and how do we utilize that as a mechanism to allow transformation to happen in that student through leading? And that's another thing to talk with about, in your specific context. Talking openly about hard issues, we talked about that. When we're afraid to talk about an issue, a kid's definitely not going to come talk to us about it, and they're going to feel even more isolated. There's one more adult I can't talk to about being gay. There's one more adult I can't talk to, about my body image. Having an open door with non-judgment. You guys have heard the saying, only God can judge. Who am I? It's our job to listen and to validate. Not necessarily validating the behavior, but validating the feelings behind the behavior. I understand you feel overwhelmed, so you want to escape through partying every weekend. Let's talk about how we can help you not feel so overwhelmed. What support do you have out there? So validating that emotion or that feeling behind the behavior is the most important thing. Then this I'm just going to touch on real quickly, and this is all based on Florida state statutes, because that's where, unfortunately, every state has their own statutes on child abuse. But who's the mandated reporter? Any person who knows or has reasonable cause to suspect that a child is abused, abandoned, or neglected by a parent, legal custodian, caregiver, or other person responsible for the child's welfare. We as youth directors and are considered other professional child care workers in the state of Florida. So if you do have to make a report, there have been times where I've made a report as a youth director, not as a therapist, where I've been able to make an anonymous report for whatever reason. They did not consider me a professional child care worker. There are other times that I've had to make a report where the reporter required me to give my contact information. So just kind of know that you may or may not be able to make an anonymous report depending on how they define your role, that specific reporter. What needs to be reported? If there's a child in need of supervision who has no parent, legal custodian, or responsible adult, a child abused by a parent, caregiver, guardian, or other person responsible for the child's welfare, child abuse, abandonment, or neglect by any adult. So that would be, if an outside adult were to abuse a child. Child abuse by a juvenile sex offender. That's an interesting one, for the state of Florida gets into real specifics about age. If you're over the age of 16, you're this tier, juvenile sex offender. If you're under 14, you're this tier. If you're 16 and a child of this, it gets real specific in there. And so, best case is report. When in doubt, report. If you have a gut feeling, report. Is kind of what they tell us to go on. Here in Florida, we have an abuse hotline. It's through Department of Children and Families, 1-800-96-ABUSE, and then you can actually do online reporting as well, and they will also report via fax, which is interesting. So it does, in Florida, typically take about 30 minutes, depending on how complicated the situation is, to an hour. They will ask you if you know where the child resides, who their parents are, contact, they'll ask you lots of details. So the more information you have, the better. Sometimes my biggest thing is if someone's coming to me, my biggest thing is it needs to be my firsthand knowledge. If a student comes to me and says, hey, like, my dad's abusing me, here's the marks, I've got firsthand knowledge. It's now my job to make a report. If someone else comes to me and says, so-and-so's told me that 4 weeks ago, this happened. Okay, let me sit here, you need to call. You need to make the report. Anyone can make an abuse report. Let me help you in making that report. Because without the firsthand knowledge, there's not necessarily a whole lot that, and reporters will go through, they'll ask you, the receivers will ask you a few questions. It's not our job to determine what's abuse, neglect, abandonment. It's our job to report. It's other people who are highly trained's job to figure out if it's abuse, neglect, or abandonment. So it kind of gets us off the hook with that. Talk for a minute about the previous. Did you guys already talk about this? You might have already talked about this when we talked about it. But what did your other adults do to respond to the situation that you shared about? Did you guys already kind of talk about your response? Oh, a little. Okay. Well, if you didn't, talk about it for a minute, and then we'll come back. Does anybody have anything that they want to share on this?
Okay, so what we were talking about is that I had to keep on, this is my second week in the job, so we talked about not having those relationships built up. I had a girl, we were on a hotel, we were standing on a hotel roof, there was like a rooftop pool kind of thing. She was leaning over the railing, all of us were looking out over the city in Austin, Texas. She's leaning over the railing and she starts saying like, oh, I wonder if I could fly, I wonder if I could, she's talking about jumping. So I was like, oh. So, and so my kind of first reaction was to sit, listen for a second, and be like, let's talk about this. More specifically, let's talk about this on that couch right there that is farther away from this railing. It's not on the edge of the roof. What a metaphor. I just need you to walk away from the edge of the roof right now. We'll deal with everything else later. Right now, just step back. So anyway, I sat and talked for a while, and I felt like that went well, but I had a whole situation when I came back. The girl was 18, she was leaving for college in 2 weeks. Which is so it kind of changes this is not technically a child, this is an adult who's in for college in 2 weeks. Are her parents knowing, they can't, she's still going to college in 2 weeks, is she gonna be okay to go? And that's not really my call, I just met you. So when I look back at it, I wasn't, because I still felt really unsteady in my job and in my relationship, I wasn't as proactive or as aggressive about making sure she got, I kind of talked to her parents and said this is something she said, it kind of concerned me, and they sort of brushed it off, oh, it's an attention thing. And now I think about it, I should have been more aggressive about making sure she was set up to go to college successfully. And now if I'm in a situation, I feel like I can handle it better, but it was such a hard, I felt just so unstable, in that relationship and those things. But I felt like I handled it right then, but I'm not sure I set her up to be successful in the long term, So.
Yeah, that's a really tough situation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like you handled it well, considering the relationship that you had. I mean, that's tough to come in 2 weeks and bam. And then she's gone in 2 weeks. It's not like there's even a long term, hope there. Wow. Awesome. Well, our role as a church is to consistently point teens towards a transforming relationship with Jesus. God does not always heal people from everything. It's not like pray about it and your depression will go away. I'm not saying that's not possible, but it's not always likely. But as you all know, God does have the power to transform lives in the midst of situations. And so our role as the church is to keep pointing people towards Jesus and walk with them through those situations. We can do this by providing meaningful connections to God in our teaching times, in our churches, in our worship times, in retreats, providing safe sanctuary for all teens, open and accepting, because teens they're going through stages in their life and they need a place of acceptance that's safe. Supporting parents and guardians. We may not have the answers, but just parenting teenagers is one of the hardest jobs you'll do. Goes a long way with a parent that's having a teenager that's struggling with something. Just that validation of them, even if you don't necessarily have an answer. And then helping provide resources or connecting our families to resources. One of our big things, and I gave you the sheet at our church, we have actually a notebook of community-wide resources. And this is, it spans everything that you could think of, most social service organizations, national hotlines. These are the ones up top, the organization contact information. Some are Florida specific, but a lot of them are national. And so those are, maybe that will get your list started of some resources. But here's some others that we have in our notebook that specifically relate to teens. We have our specific Alateen meetings in our community, which is for teenagers who have family members that abuse substances. Gay Straight Alliance, that's something I participate in our local high school. Campus Ministries, our Fellowship of Christian Athletes I'm connected to at our local high school. Our homeless shelters and homeless shelters that are connected with teenagers. A lot of homeless shelters won't take teenagers. So it's really important to seek out a family shelter. We have one in Daytona. And then we actually have a really cool, unique one that takes high school students and their main role. They have a house with 16 beds and house parents. And their main role is to help that successful transition into adulthood. It's called Kudas Unhooked. It's a really cool ministry. Our church supports it, but it's a community ministry. Food banks for hungry families. Get to know your school counselors. Let them know, there was one, Micah Keach actually here, was very connected to student counselors, and Tony Pierre, who I think is here too, at their local schools, school counselors, and their FCA. So when they have crises on campus, they pick up the phone and they call them to come and meet with students as support, the community support. So just being a resource to your schools, letting them know, hey, I'm here. You can refer students to my youth group that are interested. I'm here. Some schools are open to that. Some schools it's a little bit harder to get on campus. So you might have to work a little bit to build those relationships. Local mental health counseling centers. Some of you guys might have those in your church. Sometimes it's good just to find one outside of your church that takes cash patients with no insurance, so that if your kid says, I don't have insurance, well, here's one that has a sliding fee scale, or whatever. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, YMCA, anything that's positive, events that are happening to connect to your families too as well. And then I put on the bottom of this some of my favorite books and workbook resources. A lot of them are clinical. A lot of them still recognize the emotional spiritual component, because that's where I come from in the counseling is holistic perspective. Most of them are up there on the counter if you want to peruse through a couple of them, if any pop off the page and grab your attention. And then I put my contact information at the bottom, my email. If you in the future need, have a question or like, man, I really need a resource for this parent on this, or I really need a resource for myself to educate myself on, the world is pansexual, or whatever the new thing is, shoot me an email and I'll respond and give you as much, information as I have or point you in a direction, hopefully a good direction. So, yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Or I think we're out of time we're at. But
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank
glad to be
you.
here. Glad to be here. So, as you can tell, it's something I'm passionate about, excited about.